Actually, given what my children call my outdoor field voice, I don't need a mic except for the fact that there are other electronic desires to do things with my speech. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here, and I thank you for the kind introduction and the grand welcome. And especially given the initial comments, of course, I can't resist going off text a little bit to remind you that Senator Obama, an hour and a half ago, delivered his half-hour address to the nation that he purchased time for on all of the major networks. And one of the interesting things about that talk is that it did some things that one might expect and hope for, but it reflected one of the really major changes that have happened in the last year or year and a half in American politics. And that change is that when people started running for president, when that whole herd of people started running for president almost 2 years ago now, everyone was convinced that by this time the major issue would be the Iraq War and the global war on terror. And for better or for worse, that is not the case. There was, in Senator Obama's half-hour speech, there was 2 sentences on the Iraq war, and the basic position was, it's a waste of money. We should be spending that money on health care and Social Security and other kinds of non-military programs. Now that's a good start, but I do want to remind everyone that the American presidential campaign has transformed itself over the last 2 years from being one in which the international and global issues appeared to be primary to one in which essentially the financial crisis, the global financial crisis, has preempted most of the other kinds of debates. And so as we look to next Tuesday and the results, I think that we should be keeping in mind that increasingly, as the American voters think about their voting choice, that choice is unfortunately not going to be determined by their global perspective so much as by their local pocketbook. But at any rate, with that, that's due warning. And I'm happy to talk about American politics all the time. The little thing that was buried in my bio that you may not recognize as important in American politics is that I spent 30 years in New Hampshire. That means I spent the time for 7 presidential primaries in New Hampshire. And in American politics, the small state of New Hampshire has a presidential primary that is essentially the beginning of the campaign. So I have been always involved in American presidential politics, but given, of course, the press and all, I won't necessarily tell you who I will vote for, but I suspect you'll have some suspicion by the end of my talk. The subject is an important one. The wording was suggested by my colleague. He said, would you talk about? And I said, sure. The West-Islam dialogue, where are we and where are we going? As we look at that subject in the year 2008, the basic point that I will be making in the next 45 minutes or so is that the nature of this West-Islam dialogue has been transformed significantly in recent decades. And what one has to do is recognize what are things that have now become cliches. In fact, although we all know it, globalization has changed the way we all live. Sometimes for the better, and as we've seen in the current financial crisis, sometimes for the worse. But globalization has transformed virtually every aspect of life, from the financial and economic and marketing and business to the political and international relations, and what I would like to suggest as well, it has transformed the faith dimensions of human life. The intense communication made possible by the global electronic community and the remarkable mobility of people have made a world in which the senses of identity and the ways of community are radically new. And so these processes are changing the nature of the basic sociocultural units in which we live. And then, to be specific, the West, as in the title, and Islam, as in the title, are changing. Now, I want to emphasize that what I am is a historian. I mean, I've had a couple of good conversations with a number of people, and I have to keep reminding people that my analysis is not an analysis to produce theological truth. What I want us to do is to look at the historic experience of what human beings are doing and what human beings have constructed, not what God has revealed. And so that I might change the title slightly, given what I'm going to be saying, and change it to the West historic Islam dialogue. Not the theological Islam dialogue, but the historic Islam dialogue. Because in fact, the historical communities that Muslims have created are being as significantly transformed as the historic communities that people in the West, or that people in China, or that people in India have been creating. So that my real, I can say what I'm going to say in the next half hour in 2 sentences. The fundamental nature of what has been known as the West historic Islam dialogue is now different from what it was in the days of European imperialism, and also is different from the days of the 20th century style global international relations. So I want to start with looking at old style dialogue for a moment. There are 2 old style dialogues that I want us to think about. The first is the one that is really embedded in the conceptualization when one normally talks about inter-civilizational dialogue or inter-civilizational clash. When I teach world history, one of the important concepts is the concept of a civilization. A civilization has a particular, as a term, has a particular meaning and concept in the overall view of world history. It is a particular form of human organization that human beings developed 3,000 to 5,000 or 6,000 years ago in varying spots around the earth. And that complex form of human organization developed ways that humans could live together in large groups. And we give it the label cities. And so that we then call the big social organization centered on cities cityization. That is, civilization is really complex social organization focused on cities. And the city-based complex social organizations, the civilizations, as they developed around the world, had distinctive cultural characteristics. So that it is possible, as a world history teacher, to talk about the emergence of Chinese civilization as a distinctive cultural entity within the broader framework and category of civilizations. It's possible to talk about Indian civilization. It's ultimately possible to talk about two civilizations that defined their particular cultural characteristics later than, say, Indian or Chinese, when you look at Western civilization and Islamic civilization. I think, just parenthetically, it is worthwhile noting that Western civilization and Islamic civilization are brothers rather than in chronological order. Classical Middle Eastern civilization and classical Roman civilizations may have been the social earlier manifestations of civilization in the Mediterranean region and in the Middle East. But what we know of as Western civilization has roots, say, in Greece and Rome, but what we know as Western civilization is something that emerges after the fall of the Roman Empire, in the same way that what we know as the human organization of Islamic civilization emerges after the beginning of Islam as a faith in the 7th century. And so throughout the early centuries then of world history, in the last 2,000 years, you have a world that is made up of separate, clearly identifiable and distinguishable civilizations that share the idea that they are large human organizations built around city kind of structures, but have distinctive cultural manifestations. And so that one of the important themes in world history then is to ask, how do these civilizations interact? How do they work together? How do they engage in conflict? How do they learn from each other, and so on? And so that in that framework, you have then the West historic Islam dialogue is an inter-civilizational dialogue. Now in this, again, I would just remind you, I'm saying historic Islam. I'm not talking about the faith of Islam. I am talking about the human society that Muslims created around the great cities that stretched all the way from Toledo to Delhi and so on. Now in those years then, historic Islam and West dialogue was inter-civilizational, sometimes conflictual, as we see in the Crusades, sometimes, as in Al-Andalus, friendly cooperation. But the great term for the Andalus civilization is this marvelous term, convivencia. But convivencia has within it an interesting assumption. Convivencia is living togetherness. But if you say living together, what you have to have are two separate things that live together. Convivencia recognizes that you have Western civilizational traditions emerging and Islamic civilizational traditions emerging, and for that beautiful moment in Al-Andalus, these lived together in convivencia. In other words, dialogue in that framework is interaction among geographically separate, culturally distinct groupings. And that is a vision that shapes not just what happened, but it shapes also our terminology and the way we look at the world today even. But there is a second dialogue that is also then, it comes chronologically later, there is a second dialogue that gives us some of the problems that my colleague was talking about just briefly in his first, in his comments. That is, once we begin to be in what is identifiably the modern era, we have a new form of dialogue emerging within the framework of the West Historic Islam dialogue. Modernity emerged as a Western reconstruction of complex society. Modernity in many ways, and this we can talk about if you feel like it, modernity is a destroyer of civilization. What I mean by that is that modernity creates conditions whereby what I was defining as civilizations begin to dissolve. That is, what I was saying a civilization is a complex society centered on cities with a clear cultural identity. Now, one of the interesting things that's happened is, for example, the center of that kind of structure has been transformed by modernity. That is, what we call the city now is not what cities used to be. I mean, I am looking forward. I'm going to try and get myself onto a tour. I've been in Kuala Lumpur a number of times, but I've never been down to Malacca. And if we go to Malacca, you can see a good old-fashioned city that is the kind of city that civilizations had. You know, a wall, a center, and so on, and a clearly defined boundary between the urban and the rural. And you come back here to Kuala Lumpur, and it's a little difficult to find the boundary between rural and urban, for example. What you have here is a modern and now increasingly a postmodern large collection of people that doesn't really resemble in structure what, say, Athens or Cairo or Baghdad were in medieval times. But in the 19th century, these social transformations, where they began, was in Europe, and so that the emergence of these new kind of social structures came to be identified with the West. And so that the processes of expansion of modernity in the 19th century took the form, essentially, of identifying modernization with Westernization. Now, this creates a new context for West historic Islam dialogue, because it creates an asymmetric interaction rather than an equal interaction of the historic intercivilizational dialogues. The asymmetric interaction assumed that somehow historic Islam would become modern, and in the 19th century that meant it would become Western. And so the historic Islam-West dialogue is changed in its nature by modernity to an asymmetric power dialogue in which one person thinks it has, or one engager in the dialogue thinks it has all of the things to say and won't listen to anybody else. And so the West historic Islam dialogue in 19th century modernity wasn't a dialogue, it was a sermon from the West. Now, I think the interesting thing, one of the interesting things as we're looking at this is that we need to recognize that 19th century modernity was 19th century modernity. And modernity itself has changed and has become global. And in the course of the last century, there has been a very important transformation of modernity from being simply a Western kind of phenomenon to becoming a global phenomenon in which the heirs to the other civilizations have been able to create culturally distinctive new modes of modernity, so that many analysts begin to talk about not modernity when they're looking historically or when they're looking analytically. They're not talking about modernity as a single thing, but they are talking about multiple modernities. And in my, I had a lecture on Islamic modernism yesterday at ISTAC, and one of the things that I said was that as we look at Islamic modernism, it has two phases. In the early phase in the 19th century, people like Muhammad Abdu and so on were asking the question, can Islam be modern? But in the 20th century, that question has happily been changed by Muslims to the question not can Islam be modern, but can we Islamize modernity? Can modernity become Islamic? And that creates for us a sense then of a multiple modernity, and by the beginning of the 21st century, we have then a new context for dialogue. So to summarize then that phrase, I started trying to define our lead, the West in Historic Islam Dialogue. To summarize then, where have we been? We have been in two phases of this kind of dialogue. We have been in the phase of inter-civilizational relations, debates about the clash of civilization and discussions of dialogue. And we can think of this as the framing of the first dialogue, framed really within the ideas of territorially separate, culturally distinct, independent civilizations. Now, we still inherit that in the analysis of people like Samuel Huntington. Now, I got my degree from Harvard, so I guess I'm not supposed to say bad things about Harvard professors. And I'm not saying a bad thing about Samuel Huntington, I'm just saying he's wrong. No, I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm saying that Samuel Huntington's analysis of the clash of civilizations is absolutely perfect if he were a consultant to Pope Urban for providing a position paper for the Crusades. But for 20th century and 21st century presidents, it misreads the actual nature of the kind of dialogue and of the kind of clashes that are out there in the world. So what happens when civilizations are no longer separate? The nature of the dialogue changes. That second dialogue continues. The Western-oriented modernization dialogue continued in the 19th and 20th century. And that also is wrong now. One of the things that we learn in the second half of the 20th century is that the old-fashioned modernization theory, which was also a theory of inter-civilizational relations. Modernization theory essentially said that there was a single pattern of modernity that everybody had to adopt. And so that, as I said, the dialogue was not a dialogue, it was a monologue of instruction. It was a monologue of instruction of consultants who tried to modernize societies in their own way, in the consultant's way, rather than in the society's way. But by the end of the 20th century, we are now in a new world. And so that we really face then, where are we now, and where will we be going? The New West and the new historic Islam provide contexts that challenge all of us to rethink how we are doing things. There are still conflicts. I mean, part of the difficulty that I always have when I get involved in this is people say, oh, you know, globalization isn't a panacea. Some people think that globalization means that everybody gets along. And that, of course, isn't true. You have globalization of bitter conflict as well. I mean, for better or for worse, the way that the current American administration conceives of the war on terror is a manifestation of globalization. As much as Doctors Without Medicines, Without Borders is a globalization. So that we still have conflicts, we still have dialogues, but there are new frameworks. And there are a couple of dimensions of these new frameworks that I want to talk to you because of the impact that they have on this subject of the West and historic Islam in dialogue. One of the really significant and important developments of especially the last 25 years has been the emergence of significant communities of Muslim Westerners. Now, I want you to really hear the wording that I just said. I didn't say Western Muslims. I said Muslim Westerners. People who are Western, who are also Muslim. Not just sort of immigrants in the diaspora who have come and still are something else, but sort of perched in the West. You have the emergence of significant communities of Muslim Westerners. Now, these new Muslim Westerners are best described, at least in terms of my experience. I know most about the new Muslim Westerners that are developing within the United States. There is an emerging generation of Americans who are Muslim, and they come from two different kinds of origins. One of them are Muslim Americans that I would identify as post-immigrant. And this is in many ways an old-fashioned American custom, if you will, that people begin to lose the identification that they had, that their grandparents had with the homeland that they came from. I like to use myself as an example. Now, since it's hot weather, I don't have my East Coast Harvard tweed on, so that it doesn't quite make it so effective, but I should be quintessentially WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, at least from my accent and my look and things like that. And that's true. But I'd like to remind people that all four of my grandparents were not born in the United States. And both my mother and my father did not speak English at home. My mother spoke Swedish when she went to church, and my father spoke German when he went to church. Now, of course, what that meant when they got married was that they didn't speak either Swedish or German to me, so I have real problems with those languages. But I am third generation American. And I think that as you look at the third generation post-immigrant Muslims, they are more defined by their American experience than they are by the instruction of their grandparents. And so that you have emerging a new generation of immigrant Muslims. And at the same time, these are people who are working with and becoming part of a community of Muslims that is a little more difficult to find the right term for, but usually we end up talking about indigenous Muslims. That is, Muslims whose origins are from Africa, many of whose ancestors then came as a part of the slave trade and came to the United States unwillingly. They were involuntary immigrants. But they've been there a long time. And within the African American community, there is a significant number of Muslims, so that in the United States, as we look at the Muslim communities, probably 60 to 70% of the American Muslims and Muslim Americans are of recent immigrant origin, but 35 to 40% of them are African American, a very different experience. But in the early 20th century and throughout much of the 20th century, these two Muslim communities had separate histories. But by the end of the century, black Muslims, African American Muslims, and post-immigrant Muslims have come together to create a more effective sense of a distinctive, multiracial, multicultural American Muslim identity. Now, this is not a quiz. Well, I am a professor, but I won't grade you on it. But I do want to just ask one question to see how global this is. How many of you have ever heard of in the United States something called the fake news program, which is associated with a person by the name of Jon Stewart, and the show is called The Daily Show? Have any of you heard of that? One? Oh, okay. You know, The Daily Show is straight, old-fashioned American stand-up comedy with 21st century sophistication. If you want to get American news analysis that in fact is right to the point, go to a fake news show like The Daily. They have a website and so on. But why I ask that question is that this Daily Show, The Daily Show and Jon Stewart, is the essence of younger generation American sensibilities. And one of the interesting things is that on that show, relatively frequently, there are younger, new Muslim Americans who are authors, who are actors, who are comedians, who come on the show just like everybody else. I mean, it reflects an integration of the American Muslim. Now, more seriously than this very serious fake comedian news, I would just point to a whole series of people who are clearly both American and Muslim. Malcolm X is probably the great prototype. And then Muhammad Ali, who used to be Cassius Clay, the world champion boxer. And the person, God rest his soul, who just recently died, the great black Imam Warith Din Muhammad. Now, these are people who are clearly Muslim, and these are people who are clearly American, and they reflect in many ways the emergence of the new Muslim Western community. And what this requires us then is to think in terms of the global ummah as no longer a territorially defined Muslim majority entity. It requires us to begin to recognize that the ummah is global. Now, similarly, the other element that I want to mention that sort of is a result of 21st century kinds of developments that is changing the nature of West historic Islam dialogue is what's happening in Muslim majority societies. Many Muslim majority societies, and I look around here, many Muslim majority societies are clearly identifiable as global, multicultural, cosmopolitan societies. And there is emerging a global, cosmopolitan, multicultural sense of identity, which still is identified with Islam, but is not identified with necessarily a particular culture in an exclusive way. Some scholars are beginning to talk about this as rooted, that is culturally identified or religiously identified, rooted cosmopolitanism. In culture, I think of someone that is by name Youssou N'Dour, who is a Senegalese singer. He is a follower of the Murid Tariqa. He sings odes of praise to the Sheikh who established the order, Ahmadu Bamba. But he does it in jazz and hip-hop. And his music is a marvelous synthesis of the traditions of the storytellers of West Africa with the development of African American music and with the development of a whole wide range of cultural elements to it. You have a whole variety of examples. One can look at business and see the global business, the global business class. I mean, I look at the name on the center that I have, Prince Al-Walid bin Talal. And everybody says, Saudi prince. We know what they are. But you don't. I mean, this is a guy who is his mother was the daughter of the first prime minister of Lebanon. He is the senior shareholder of Citibank. He is the person who provided the money for the French Disney World. He is a global cosmopolitan who happens to have a genealogy associated with the Saudi royal family. He's a global cosmopolitan, though. Or you have a whole variety of other kinds of people who are involved. So we are talking about the new cosmopolitanism. And here I really want to, what shall I say, skate out on thin ice. I wanted to skate out on thin ice because every time I told people I was going to come here and stand next to Professor Kamali and say civilization is over, they all would smile and say, oh, that'll be interesting. And I think it becomes important because rather than, well, I don't want to get involved in local politics. I got enough involvement in local politics at home. So this is not a political comment on political programs, but rather it is an analytical comment on the concept of Islam Hadari, which I find very interesting because as we look in the talk and you get the 10 fundamental principles, the 10 fundamental principles of Islam Hadari have much to do with Islam, and they have much to do with a proper moral social order. After faith and piety in Allah, you have a just and trustworthy government, a free and independent people, a vigorous pursuit and mastery of knowledge, a balanced and comprehensive economic development, a good quality of life for the people, and so on. Now, this you could put as a campaign text in Barack Obama's political campaign. It is not tied to a specific social structure that is historically defined in particularist cultural terms. And so what we have, and as I say, I'm not advocating any political party or anything like that, but I think what we have in the definition of Islam Hadari is not an affirmation of the human-created historic social structures of medieval Islam. What you have as defined in these lectures, and very well edited, of course, what you have instead is a redefinition of what Hadari is in a global cosmopolitan term. There is nothing in that. There is nothing in those 10 principles, as I say, that either John McCain or Barack Obama would say shouldn't be there. It represents a vision of a moral society within the cosmopolitan universe of the 21st century. But that then raises the question, You know, if we're looking at Islam Hadari in this way, what does that do? In the same way that what does the emergence of Muslim Westerners do, or the emergence of cosmopolitan singers like Yusun Durdu, what does that do to how we look at West historic Islam dialogue? And what it does, of course, is it transforms it. It puts it into a new kind of context. And I would suggest that, particularly now, I want to look at the core function of the center that I'm at. It's a center for Muslim-Christian understanding. And so I want to just briefly talk about Muslim-Christian dialogue. That what it does, what the new world of the 21st century does, is it transforms the place where, or the arena of, Muslim-Christian dialogue. Some of the most important Muslim-Christian dialogue these days is taking place in countries that are not Muslim-majority countries. You have major Muslim-Christian dialogue in the United States, for example. And in a very practical sense, I would just like to observe that in this process of dialogue, not conflict, in this process of dialogue, 9/11, the destruction of the World Trade Center, is an important element. I've worked for many, many years with Muslim-Christian dialogue. And for most of that time, in the 45 years that I've been teaching about Islam and so on, for most of that time, it was if people were interested, they were interested in, okay, how can we get along with those crazy Egyptians? Or how can we do something with the Iranians? Or something like that. It was the broader, they're them and we're us, and how can we talk to each other? But it was a relatively ho-hum thing. One of the things that happened after 9/11 was, of course, that there were some Americans who became very distraught, upset, and said, okay, we can't have anything to do with these horrible people. But the overwhelming reaction instead, I mean, at least practically from my vision, was it made our center a lot busier than it had ever been before. Because people from all over the country were saying, oh, I've just realized I have a Muslim friend down the block. You know, what can I do to get together? And 9/11 increased by a major factor the number of Muslim-Christian dialogues that were taking place around the United States. And that continues on today. And so, Muslim-Christian dialogues are now no longer confined to being across the boundaries of old-style civilizations. And probably one of the most important manifestations of this comes in terms of something that I hope some of you or at least are familiar with. It's a major statement by almost 150 major Muslim leaders around the world called A Common Word Between Us. It was a statement by major Muslim leaders to major Christian leaders around the world to identify what it was that they shared in common. And this becomes, I think, the kind of symbol for what is now Muslim-Christian dialogue, and what becomes then, I think, the prototype of the positive dimensions of the future of the West historic Islam dialogue. As you look at the list of people who signed that statement, they come from every part of the Muslim world, Muslim majority countries, Muslim minority countries. They come from academic institutions. They include grand muftis. They include Sunnis and Shiis. They include liberal Wahhabis. Everybody's happy with that. They include liberal Wahhabis as well as conservative liberals. You know, it's a great diversity. But what it opens is then an opportunity for something that I think, I'd like to just close with the thought that it opens the opportunity for maybe beginning to change the label of what we need to be engaged in. And Usman in particular, and his predecessor in being a visiting professor at Georgetown, Kamal Hassan, have helped me in my own mind begin to rethink what the future, what's coming for the West Historic Islam dialogue. And that is, in this world of intense intercommunication, of intense mobility, I like to make my colleagues nervous by saying, I think my task is to bring an end to Muslim-Christian dialogue. That's because dialogue implies that when I sit, Muslim-Christian dialogue as a term, it implies that when I sit down next to Usman and we're both having a cup of coffee and we're talking about religious things, we are having an interfaith dialogue. And that very rapidly disappeared. Usman and I have had lots of conversations about religion. Now, he happens to be a Muslim. I happen to be a Christian. But that wasn't the core of what we were getting together about. We were talking about the nature of science. We were talking about how do you classify knowledge. We were talking about those kind of things, and we were not engaging in Muslim-Christian dialogue. We were engaging in religious conversation. And I think that ultimately, if we want to be optimistic and positive, the only real future for the West Historic Islam dialogue has to be the transformation of dialogue of one other with another to conversations of people who recognize that we all share a common humanity on a globe that we're all going to have to save. Thank you very much. I'll sit over here and we can have discussion.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this very thought-provoking, rich, and enlightening discourse that you have had with us, and I hope that that the audience has received it the way that I have, and I think that if there is a silver lining behind this cloud, it is that it has made us, the general public, in the West, in America, in the Muslim world as well, the level of awareness for change has become that it has raised. The necessity of engagement and constructive engagement, I think, has come to the forefront of our consciousness. And Professor John Voll has drawn our attention that after 9/11, the tragic events of 9/11, the American public has taken greater interest in Islam, its civilizational richness, in the historical conversation that has always been there between these two great civilizations. I think that if one reflects to the predicament of the Muslim minorities in America, compare it to Europe, they have integrated better in the American society than they have been able despite the longer presence in other places of the Western world. And I think that is a sign for hope. I think that the kind of, minuscule engagement that he had with Usman, I think it is representative of the kind of America is a great diversity from within. And I think that there are, isn't it significant that in the middle of all this, and you know, post 9/11, the kind of discourse and events that emerges in the center of Georgetown, a place, Prince Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. You can appreciate that America has internal diversity, it has inner lights within themselves, and has internal corrective mechanisms. And I think that it is also significant and reassuring for this institute, for myself, who have been working on Islam Hadwari as an engagement that it offers, not between Islam and the West, that it offers great potential, but for the Muslim world itself. We have been looking within our midst for fresh leadership of thoughts in agendas that can contribute to good governance, that can contribute to our civilizational perspectives in how we engage with other communities and within ourselves. If you read moral and cultural integrity, if you read a just and trustworthy government, a free and independent people, protection of the rights of minorities and women, actually Islam in the West stand behind the same platform. And I think that is a prospect we hope to be a context for our constructive future engagement. I will pass on now to Professor Usman Bakar, Emeritus Professor and a distinguished shareholder of Malaysia in Georgetown, long-term associate and friend of that institution. And I think that he will now chair the rest of the question and answer session, if I may request you, Professor Usman.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and very good morning. Thank you, Professor Hashim. I would like to take this opportunity to thank my colleague, Professor John Voll, with whom I have the opportunity to teach together at Georgetown. He is the second John to have come here. Some of you have attended John Esposito's talk, and today we have John Voll's talk, but I'm sure you realize the difference between the two. I think the main reason is because Professor John Voll speaks on the topic of Islam and West dialogue from the perspective of a historian, and I think it is very important. We were treated along the way in his presentation on the changes. In fact, he wants to change the topic, emphasize the word historic Islam, and we have to understand why he insists on that. Partly is because the word Islam in the West, United States, Islam is understood in different senses. When you say Islam and the West dialogue, which Islam? And the question is which Islam, because precisely because there is that understanding that there are several Islam, and the emphasis by John just now, the historic Islam. It's not Islam as a faith, but Islam in its societal and civilizational manifestation. I think that is important, the unfolding of this Islam and the relationship with the West. Okay, I don't want to go from this. I want to take this to invite, to give the chance to you all to ask, to comment to Professor Voll on the topic. And it is interesting that, in a sense, his answer to where are we going, we need to look at several developments in the West, including the emerging Western Muslim community, Muslims who are Westerners, I mean, who are indigenous to the United States and Europe, and what possibilities they have in store for the 21st century global Muslim Ummah. And of course, the mentions about the explosion of Muslim-Christian dialogue since September 11, resulting in the current agenda on the common word conversation between Muslims and Christians. And finally, of course, he wants to re-examine our usual understanding of dialogue in light of what we said. I mean, when he as Christian and I as Muslim have discussed about religion, are we having a dialogue, or it just happens to be two people, Christian and Muslim, having a conversation on religious issues or whatever issue, even on other issues. Okay, I welcome now. Yes, Dato', if you can, I hope you can, for the purpose of record, just say your name and the organization you present. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. My name is Ismail Noor. I'm a founding director of the Malaysian Interfaith Network, and currently I hold the position of acting president. We set up this organization to promote goodwill and harmony among various faiths in the country and also outside the region. And one of the linkages that I, as a Muslim and as an office holder in the Malaysian Interfaith Network, is the linkage with chapter 49, verse 13 of the Quran, in which God says, "O mankind, we created you in pairs, male and female, in nations and in communities, so that you get to know each other." And of course the inference there is so that you don't detest each other. And on that platform, we are moving to create this understanding and tolerance within the context of the faiths in Malaysia and elsewhere. I would like to refer to your earlier series of questions, one of which was, can modernity become Islamic? My personal view on this is that I think the word modernity can be closely linked to, as you say, the word that you used was globalization. And not only that, I think it's capitalism that's the essence of globalization. My personal view is that this has brought a lot of unhappiness on the scene, including the recent financial and economic meltdown. And the effects or the after effects of globalization or capitalism. And if capitalism is projected in its extreme form, we get what is happening in many ways today, even in our society in Malaysia. For instance, Darwinistic tendencies, the so-called survival of the fittest. And that is an approach that we take that's exclusive, not inclusive, that becomes a problem. And it's power-based. Secondly, it's Machiavellianistic in orientation. Doesn't matter the methods that I employ as long as I get what I want. And for the young ones, I think what has affected them is these hedonistic tendencies. They live in a world of fantasy with all those that have been brought about by globalization. I mean, free credit, clubbing, enjoyment, and so on. And we're feeling the effects of these here. Now, I think where Islam can come in is the sense of balance, a sense of balance, a sense of holistic orientation, and a sense of altruistic consideration for others. It's a sincere consideration for others, rather than the me, and what's in it for me factor. So this is where I think Islam can be a factor in terms of playing a role in this so-called modernity that we have been talking about. Perhaps you can comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
IAIS. Thank you, Professor Voll, for that very, very interesting overview of the philosophical roots of what we're talking about here. I'd like to offer a comment and ask for your counsel on a particular issue that interests me, particularly as I come from the West and I'm a Muslim. Islam takes for granted the existence of cities, as you said, in the construction and development of Muslim societies. And the history of Islamic civilization is very closely linked to the development of cities as complex social organizations. And outside of the city is seen as an important aspect of civilization, but only insofar as it regenerates what happens within the urban areas. So you have, things like the Rabat, that is not part of the city, is actually defined as not being part of the city, but very important in defining what the city becomes. Because people go from the city and they go there, they defend the borders of the city, they train, they subject themselves to teachings of shayukh, they ponder the nature of existence and so on, and then they go back to the city to rejuvenate it. So it really is linked to the city, but there are other elements in that worldview of what Islam views as civilization. It's not just the city, there are other philosophical elements that I'm sure that you're more aware of than I am. Now, I offer that because I wonder, in this discussion of Islamizing modernity, we tend to forget that. Now, you're aware of this as well, as I'm sure all the members of the panel are. There are different approaches in that discussion of Islamization. Even the word itself is argued upon, who came up with it first. One of the approaches is what I would say a sincere one, but perhaps a bit superficial, in accepting the structures of what contemporary modernity actually means, and then trying to apply some sort of Islamic veneer onto it. And you can have a drug house and put the Basmala on the top, but it's still a drug house. There's nothing Islamic about it. Now that's rather crude, but it's what I see on many different types of institutions and ideas that are coming about, where we kind of accept the grammar of the language of modernity, but we want to change the vocabulary a little bit. That's one approach. Another approach is really to get into the real philosophical meanings of what modernity actually means and try to analyze what the corresponding values in Islam actually are, and try to rejuvenate an Islamic civilization from within that. And that's a very different sort of approach, because it doesn't take anything for granted. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how those two things interact with each other. And you're in Malaysia, where those two sort of things collided on a regular basis, or so I'm told, because I've only been here for a couple of months. My final point, which is a question to you, you spoke of Muslim minorities in the West, and you spoke of those two different types of minorities, the indigenous and the immigrant. Now, I myself have a very mixed feeling about those two categories, because I'm both. On one side, and we're all among friends here, I can trace my Muslim ancestors back to the first community. On my other side, it's only one generation, so I have both. And I look at my community, which is not American, despite the way that I talk. It's European, and I see how they are actually trying to cope with these questions that you talk about. And it's a very difficult one, because they really exist in the heart of modernity. And they are, as you said, they're not Muslims living in the West, they are Western Muslims, for better or for worse. And that's simply what they have. And I was reading a few weeks ago the writings of one very famous Western Muslim, T.J. Winter from Cambridge University. He's one of the signatories to the Common Word and one of the main sort of inspirants of it. And he was reflecting on when he converted to Islam, which was back in the late 70s. And he was asking, in his own rhetorical sort of way, what contributions the Western Muslim had to give. And in his very typical, I mean, I'm sure you know him, in his very typical way, he said absolutely nothing at all. Because as far as he was concerned, Western Muslims came from a civilization that was based on destroying civilization. You know, the sacred value of what civilization was supposed to mean was absent as far as he was concerned in the West. So whereas people who converted to the faith from other civilizations in medieval times could bring great treasures and wisdom from those other civilizations that they had converted from, Western Muslims didn't really have too much to offer. He backtracks later on and says, well, perhaps there's something that a Western Muslim can actually contribute, and that's because modernity is actually Westernization. It is actually a Western construct, and nobody understands it better than the Westerner. So perhaps they can be the conduit through which the rest of the Muslim world, and they are the Muslim world living in the West, perhaps they are the conduits by which the Muslim world can actually understand what modernity means, instead of, you know, receiving it through the history of colonialism and post-colonialism. And I began to wonder, as a Westerner, as a Muslim, what sort of contributions the minority Western Muslim communities can actually provide in that discussion. Because it's that discussion that I feel is probably the most vital facing the world today. Thank you.
My name is Zakia Koya. I'm coming from the magazine of Voll. Throughout your lecture, you were saying West Islam, Western Muslim, as if these two are on the opposing sides of a pole. And there seems to be a need for a dialogue when, at this moment of time, as you pointed out, that there is a big group of Muslims who just call themselves Americans. They don't go around saying, I'm Muslim and I am American. They don't have to identify themselves. They just say, I'm American. But we know they are Muslims by their, you know, what they call by the name and by their acts, by the way they carry themselves. So I'm wondering, as you're an American, when will we come to a time when someone can just say, I'm American, and we don't have to, you know, be surprised when he says, I'm Muslim?
Thank you. John?
A lot of, okay, yeah, there we go. A lot of very good things to think about. I think that one of the things that I would like to do is, in listening to Hisham and to you, there's a word that I didn't really discuss, especially as I'm talking about the current development of dialogue and hopefully turning it into conversation. And that is Tawheed. Now, I think that we can start correctly by identifying the problems created by capitalistic globalization. And I think that we can look at the difficult things that tend to get reinforced by some aspects of globalization. But I think that the conclusion and the bottom line, even in what you're talking about as well, is though that in the world that we live in now in 2008, we can't sit around and just complain that globalization is awful. Whether it's awful or paradise, it is the existence in which we live, and we have to cope with it. And that I think then what we need to be looking at are the kinds of things that your organization, for example, are doing. Building bridges among different faith communities isn't something that becomes successful if you only do it in Kuala Lumpur. You know, that globalization provides an opportunity for building bridges as well as creating conflicts. And I think that the real challenge becomes how do we transform globalization into a global hadari, a global kind of mode of living together, because we are essentially different, and also living together. Now, when you were talking, and when Hisham, when you were talking about the acceptance of the grammar of modernity, I think that as we move into the 21st century, in fact, even the grammar of modernity is changing. And that the grammar of modernity is changing from a particularist mode to a holistic mode. And I think one of the interesting challenges, I won't say paradox because it can't be because it's existent, you know, but one of the challenges of the 21st century with globalism and the changing grammar of modernity is the challenge of realizing the reality of the ayah that you finished with. And that is that we are instructed that God, in the divine wisdom, created us as different genders, as different communities, and so on. And he didn't say, and therefore your task is to make everybody alike. And instead, he said, live with it because that's the way I've created you, because there's a positive purpose in your diversity. And I think one of the grand faith challenges, whether we are Christian or Muslim or Jew, one of the grand faith challenges is to redefine the grammar of our existence in a way that we can create, and I'm not sure which order of the words, but in a way that we can create Tawhidi pluralism, which is what the ayah is telling us we have to do. How can we create a pluralistic Tawhidi society? How can we have a faith that is in a pluralistic, diverse community, but yet is undergirded by a holistic and broad sense of faith and identity? And I think that brings me to your very important question. And that is this question of making, how does one get beyond having difference be a problem? That what the ayah is saying is that difference isn't a problem. And you get this diversity, even disagreement isn't a problem, it's a gift. And so that the question becomes then, how do we begin to reach that point where difference is not a shock or a surprise, but rather how do we reach that point where difference is something that we enjoy? And I think particularly within the American community, specifically the question that was asked, that one of the things that I was trying to talk about, yes, I used the term the West and I used the term Islam and I redefined the term Islam into historic Islam, but the stream of analysis was to say that increasingly from medieval times to the present, those two categories have to be viewed not as separate, distinct othernesses, not as separate, distinct civilizations that are then going to clash, but rather as pluralistic resources within the context that there's no way I'm going to be like Hisham, because he's younger than I am. I mean, you know, there's no way that I'm going to be like my wife, because we're created different gender, and so on. So that I think that one of the things that is important in the current context of dialogue and the hope of the transformation of dialogue to conversation is that we can do what, God willing, we can all do, for example, in our family. The IAIS says, created you male and female. Now, it didn't say we created you adult and children, but that's also part of it. But in any given family, every individual unit is different from every other individual unit. And part of the strength of the family is that difference. And what we all need to be doing is, within our broader social arenas, to be able to have a sense of familiarity with difference. And one of the experiences just that I want to share in this sense is that one of the joys of teaching at a university that has an international student body is the kind of discussion you can get in class. And I teach a course on Islamic modernism. And most of the time when I teach that course, I have an interesting variety of students. And Usman knows these kinds of students too. I mean, you have Muslim Americans, you have international Muslims, you have international non-Muslims, and most of them don't take a specialized course like Islamic modernism unless they're interested in the subject. And a lot of times all I have to do is sort of lift my feet and go with the flow of discussion, because what they are doing is learning from each other. And I think over the last 12 years, one of the reasons why I had positive things to say about the consequences of 9/11 is that through my experience over the last dozen years, I have seen an important transition in the students that say take my courses on something like Islamic modernism, because they have a sense of conversation despite the diversity where they come from. And we just simply have to work awfully hard to develop a greater visibility for working together. I think that in terms specifically of America, the greater visibility of Americans in the public arena who are Muslim is going to be helping. People are getting much more used to hijab than they ever used to be. People are getting much more used to a beard than they used to be. Of course, when I was a graduate student, everybody wore a beard. But at any rate, I think that I'd like to just sort of say, as we're looking at the kind of issues that were raised, just to suggest one of our intellectual and our faith challenges is the challenge of seeing the relationship between tawhid and plurality, because both are important parts of our existence.
My name is Khairi Jamaluddin. I'm a member of parliament. As a politician, my question is necessarily political, so I apologize beforehand. When we speak of a dialogue between the West and Islam, between two civilizations, I think it's obvious to most of us that these two civilizations are not monolithic. Neither is the Western civilization monolithic, and neither is the Islamic civilization monolithic, and we can't assume or view each other as a homogeneous, monolithic entity. Now, my question is how the West, and in particular the United States, views the Islamic world or the Islamic civilization. If we are to if we are to promote a genuine dialogue between the two civilizations, given that it isn't monolithic, how would you suggest in the American political consciousness amongst policymakers and the incoming administration, whoever that may be, how would you suggest they better understand the diversity that exists within the Muslim world itself? And I say this with tremendous degree of concern that the identity of Islam and the Islamic civilization has always been and continues to be conflated with an Arab identity, with a Middle Eastern identity. Whenever Islam is conflated with the Middle East or Arabism, you forget that the biggest Muslim country in the world, for instance, is Indonesia, that there are many Muslim countries like Malaysia with a significant non-Muslim minority population that has a lot to contribute towards this dialogue and this process of getting to know one another. So I'd like to know Professor Voll's thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador?
Assalamu alaikum and good morning. First of all, I would like to, I'm the High Commissioner of Pakistan.
Speak directly into this.
Okay. I said Assalamu alaikum and good morning, and I'm the High Commissioner of Pakistan. First of all, I would like to thank you, Professor, for a very enlightening talk. And at least I am introduced to some new terminologies. I would also like to qualify that my question is my personal opinion. It has nothing to do with the position or stand of my government. Because your talk, in fact, invoked a question, so that's why I'm asking. Towards the later part of your speech, you identified that dialogue could be between two identical partners or entities, like a Muslim-Christian dialogue. Dialogue between Islam and Christianity. When I see dialogue between West and Islam, then on one side is the ideology and on the other side is an entity which has a landmass, people with a particular religion, a way of life, civilization, their political aims, their economic interests. This all-encompassing on one side and just a religion on another side. I think this equation is not balanced. When we talk of 9/11, it is neither the Islam versus Christianity, nor East versus West. It's the political aims and perhaps economic interests which changed the friends of few years back into worst of the enemies today. So I would like to have your comments that unless we bring in these things, I do not know where we are, but definitely we will never reach where we want to be. And I think the aim of whole this exercise is to bring peace, tranquility within countries and the world over. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Karim?
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Karim Crow from IAIS. Thank you, Professor Voll, for an interesting and enlightening presentation. Particularly, the key point you make is that the nature of modernity is changing because we have multiple modernities, and that the basic social and economic and physical reality of human existence is increasingly monolithic. Large cities. And you go around the world from Tokyo to Mexico City, to New York City, to Kuala Lumpur, you're going to find very similar situation where people are living under parallel circumstances, and this dictates a kind of convergence indeed. And at the same time, we have our cultural and civilizational identities, which have not caught up to this new historical, physical reality. So we have imported, along with the new, so to speak, monolithic existence, we have imported also the older historical memories and values and preferences, and this can lead to conflict, and particularly in terms of Euro-America, not West, I prefer Euro-America, and the Islamic societies. Now, I noticed that conceptually you use the word tawheed to express the notion of universal or unified consciousness. So you, as an American thinker, familiar with Muslim thought, find that the Muslim notion is convenient and adequate for expressing your idea. That's an interesting example of convergence. Just as Gandhi, for example, a Hindu, used the word hijrah to express his nonviolent principle of withdrawal and non-cooperation, because he found the Islamic idea pertinent and adequate for his own actions. So this is an example of going outside of our own cultural block. But the conversation that we want to have has to be within the human family, as the ayah reminds us. It's one family. We're all the children of Adam and Eve. So it's really a conversation between brothers and sisters and cousins. And once we can move beyond the older forms of modernity where we saw separation into the new reality, John Gray, in his marvelous little book, Al-Qaeda and What It Means to Be Modern, pointed out that there are many modernities. Qaeda is actually a form of modernity, a rather peculiar hybrid and perverse, but we have to recognize it for what it is, a form of modernity for some Muslims, this jihadism. And maybe the American exceptionalism and intervention by armies into the heart of Asia is another manifestation of American modernity. But don't you think that we have to move beyond these divisions and get inside one space, the human family, because we all are on this globe together? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please, John.
Okay, I want to start with the easiest quick answer, which is the political answer. I mean, I really, how does, we start with how does the West, particularly the United States, view the Islamic world, and then how can we do something about the way, especially, I mean, I'll reword what was possibly the question, how can we do something about what American policymakers think about the Islamic world as a generic category, trying to remind them first that Islam is not a monolithic thing. One of the examples that was in my notes and that of Muslim Westerners that I simply rhetorically left over because I was spending too much time on other things. But I think one of the important resources, and going back to the question from last time, one of the very important resources, especially in the United States, is the resource of Muslims who are effectively organized in the public sphere. And I think that in Washington, for example, there's a national organization that has increasing effectiveness. It's called the Muslim Public Affairs Council, MPAC. MPAC people are people who are Americans who try to help educate congresspersons and policymakers in terms of the multiple realities of the Islamic world and Islamic life, and they do it as Americans who happen to be Muslim. I think that when some of the MPAC people go through Congress and get to be familiar with the people and the staff people, there is much less of the surprise. You know, somebody walks in and his name may be Joe, but if he comes from MPAC, he may not even have to identify MPAC. It's not a shock surprise. It's a, okay, finally you're here talking. And I think that public sector organized Islamic activity becomes increasingly important in the West in general and in the United States in particular. We have a special difficulty with it, however, and that is the parallel sensitivity in the United States among policymakers to make sure that they don't do anything that looks like they might dilute security. And so that it becomes a challenge for organizations like MPAC to make it clear that they are working with American policymakers to develop enlightened policies rather than just simply going to argue with them. But I think that, again, the emergence of Muslim organizations that function the same way that non-Muslim organizations do in the public sector to reflect the interests of a multi-religious society becomes a very important resource. I think that, you know, basically you identify our challenge. And again, it is ultimately when do we reach the point where it becomes possible for, say, in specific security terms in Pakistan, when does it become possible and how can we make it possible for U.S. military planners and Pakistani military planners to sit down and talk like Usman and I do? That may be a challenge, knowing both American and Pakistani military, but I think that that's where we need to go. And I think that to some extent, even though globalization does reflect wicked capitalism, I do think that in terms of conversation, we can learn a lot from the operation of transnational corporations in how you have conversation among diverse professionals who are working for the same cause. And I think that that becomes our family umbrella. I think, finally, as we look, the changing nature of large metropolitan cities and so on, I think this brings to me I'll be anecdotal in terms of my own teaching experience again. I started teaching world history a long time ago, and I can tell you, you'll see how long time ago it was by the example I'm going to use. I started teaching at the University of New Hampshire, okay, which is less than 100 miles north of Boston, Massachusetts, on the East Coast. In the mid-1960s, people talked about the development of the East Coast megalopolis, you know, that was the whole urban area that stretched basically from just south of Washington up through Philadelphia and New York City to Providence and Boston. And in my world history course, I would teach about the changing nature of the cities, and megalopolis was sort of the new urban formation. But in those days, what I could say was, and the way you can define the outer boundary of what, I don't like the word megalopolis, but the outer boundary of massive urbanness, the outer boundary is if you draw a line from the McDonald's that are farthest out from the old center. Because when I started teaching in New Hampshire in 1965, there were no McDonald's in New Hampshire. And I could sort of say, okay, you know, when McDonald's comes creeping up into southern New Hampshire, we'll know that megalopolis is oozing into our beloved countryside. Well, if you take that example and you draw a map around the McDonald's of the farthest extremes, you have an almost single global city, which is that enormous city that you were talking, the country that I think this is still true, the country that has the second largest number of McDonald's, second only to the United States, is Japan. And so that you have the Pacific megalopolis and the Atlantic megalopolis and so on. And I think that, again, this is what I think as we start looking at the world in which we live. I loved in the final comment this thing of the monolithic tendencies on the one hand and the particular heritages on the other, and how do we balance them. And one of the books that I would suggest is a book by an African philosopher sociologist by the name of Kwame Appiah, Appiah, because Appiah is talking about this kind of phenomenon of how can you survive both as a cosmopolitan, global, monolithic person in a sense, but still have rooted identities. And that's I think what we are all faced with. And I absolutely like the idea. Yes, Tawhid is a much more convenient term, but then of course the problem with it being an example of convergence, it's also an example of, it'll become possibly an example of stretching a meaning beyond what maybe some of my Muslim friends would take. But just to finish this line, I think that one of the new changes, I'm glad to hear people at least thinking multiple modernities and things like that, but the Islamic contribution, and this is, I want to just go back, what does the West offer, what does the Western Muslim offer, quote, and that is, there are certain conceptualizations that I think are very important. And as modernity, just like old historic civilizational structures are crumbling and disappearing in the dynamism of modernity, so the structures of modernity are crumbling and disappearing in the 21st century kind of structures that get awkwardly labeled postmodern. Now, I don't like the word postmodern because it's one of those words that you put a flag up and then everybody gets all hot and bothered about what they think postmodernity is, and they don't like Michel Foucault or something like that. They have some favorite postmodernists that they hate. And so what we are in now is an era that is after the era of the dominance of modernity modes of thought. And so let's call it after modernity. And after modernity is a mode that emphasizes holistic synthesis. And in that, the best word to use is Tawhid. I mean, we don't have an English word that has all of the same kind of synergetic, holistic meanings. But I suspect many of my Muslim friends wouldn't like me to think of Tawhid as becoming the core of a new postmodern ideology. But I do think that we all need, in fact, to use all of the resources that we have in sharing. And I think that Western Muslims can offer not just an Islamic addition to understanding modernity, but I think that Western Muslims and majority Muslims in the rest of the world are coming to a point where a Tawhidi perspective becomes a much more persuasive perspective than the old style disintegrative analytical modes of modernity.
Thank you, John. I can allow 2 more questions if, yes, one more, another question? Yes.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
I'm Salihu, Abu Salihu, now associated with the IAIS. Thank you very much, Professor John Voll, Professor Hashim, Professor Osman. Since we have some time, I'd like to introduce another element of the discussion. Now, as you pointed out, 9/11 accelerated these West historic Islam dialogue kind of sequence. But what we need to notice, we don't need a misfortune to bring people together. It should be ongoing. But all the same, this misfortune, the so-called 9/11, was not used to a fuller, broad-based dialogue setting. For instance, the great problems we are having today, the great global financial crisis of 2008. In fact, after 9/11, in fact before, the Muslim world has advocated a review of the international financial architecture. And Malaysia in particular has propounded these at forums such as the IMF and the World Bank and so on. But there was this reluctance from the United States especially, and some other Western groups, to look at these more holistically. Instead, there was this obsession of Western banks to look at the great petrodollar mountain in the Middle East. They were more concerned on getting these deposits than looking at the greater challenges facing the world. For instance, we talk about financial derivatives. As you may know, the Islamic financial system abhors derivatives. Similarly, it spurns excessive greed, which, if you recall Greenspan's testimony to the special committee, the special committee itself mentioned excessive greed by the banking community as one of the causes of the great crisis. So there were vast opportunities after 9/11 or even before that for greater problem-faced, issue-based dialogues. But these were missing. So some other examples, we talk about halal food, great opportunities for interaction and dialogue, not only West Islam, but also the new great economies of China and India. But this was not done. So we have a great human misfortune in the form of melamine, excessive melamine use, affecting the food chain not only in China but throughout the world. So is the example of genetically modified food. In the area of science and technology, there could have been better dialogue in terms of the West or in terms of historic Islam and other religions. There are specific ayat, specific hadith on various subjects such as this. But this has not been forthcoming. So the question is whether your Prince Al Walid Center or some other institutions in US or globally which you may be aware, are they looking at problem-faced or issue-based dialogue? Shukran.
Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I am Asna Hussein. I happen to be in Malaysia. Actually, I work in Aceh, Indonesia. Yeah, I have a couple of comments to make. First, when you talk about the West and its dialogue with Islam, historically you mentioned about Europe, but when you focus on contemporary dialogue, you focus a lot on America, as if Europe is, the West is America. Well, we all know that there are factors that both America and Europe share, but there are a lot of differences when it comes to dialogue between Islam and the West. even in Europe, when you go to some Scandinavian countries, Norway, for example, I mean, the dialogue there is indeed very positive. But when you go to other countries like Germany, for example, certainly there is a kind of idea that Muslims need to secularize. So if you could comment on the European contemporary experience in this dialogue. And secondly, I would like to go back to America and on the issue of after the post 9/11, the post 9/11 you mentioned, I mean the increase of dialogue between Muslim and Westerners, and I mean Christians or Jews, for example, hoping that this dialogue would lead to understanding and respect. But within the context of American experience, I think there is a big group of Americans who are moving to a different direction. For example, in the South, I happened to be a teacher through a program they call Access to the Muslim World a couple of years ago in Florida. And actually the experience was just the opposite. It was very difficult to dialogue even with students and some professors and some visitors to my talk. And last month I happened again to be in Florida and attended a Christian service in one of the most conservative Christian churches. And again, not knowing that there was a Muslim in the audience among his congregation, actually the talk about Muslims and believing that Muslim would go to hell is still very strong. So if you could also comment on this, whether how do we move this, especially this group in America, toward this positive dialogue? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay.
Well, again, really helpful kinds of issues being raised, and I want to first thank you for your a number of these observations. And I think what I'd like to do is take one thing that you mentioned and expand a little bit on it, especially since we're here in Kuala Lumpur, and that is, that there are lost opportunities and things like that, and we need to have new ways of looking at things. One of the things that is important in the 21st century that you pointed to, and that I didn't talk about, is you said China and India. And I think that as we look at the 21st century, I think that the title that we agreed on is a very important title, but it's only a title that deals with a partial topic. That the real inter-civilizational or inter-communal or interfaith or whatever label we want to give to the unit, the real relations and dialogue, if it's going to be global, has to include China, has to include India, has to include sub-Saharan Africa, and that a lot of times we end up equipping ourselves for Muslim-Christian dialogue with all of the challenges and the problem. That's a full-time job for a zillion people. But as the experience of Malaysia reminds us, that isn't the only dialogue in town. And one of the real pleasures that we had with having Brother Usman with us at Georgetown was he offered for us a course on inter-civilizational dialogue, Islam and Confucianism, right? Even some of the most cosmopolitan and sophisticated of my colleagues, oh yeah, that's right. Muslims also kind of talk to Buddhists and Confucianists and Hindus and things like that. But in America, the dynamics of the networks of global dialogue of the multiple dialogues that have to take place, those dynamics do not receive, that's another lost opportunity, if you will. And I think that very specifically, this is something where Malaysians need to be reminders of the rest of the world. It's not just the United States that sort of fixates on sort of bilateral. If we're all going to be encouraging multilateralism in a new president in the United States, God willing, we should also be encouraging multilateralism in any kind of dialogue that we're thinking about. And that brings me then to, again, this, you're absolutely right, you know, the West. But when I was talking about sort of really getting down to nitty-gritty, it was the United States. And I think that, you know, there are lots of interesting differences between Muslim Christian and Muslim secular relations in the United States, lots of differences between those in the US and in Europe generically. And I can only point to just a couple of them. But there are a couple of demographic statistics that I think are very important. Median household income of Muslims in the United States is significantly higher than median average households in the United States. That is, Muslims in the United States as a group are better off than the average Americans, which reflects the fact that many of the Muslims, particularly the immigrant Muslims who come, are professionals. Many are doctors and lawyers and business professionals and things like that. And so that Muslim-Christian discussions are very often then within a part of society where conversations are more possible. Whereas in Europe, the median household income for Muslim households is significantly below the median household income for the regular, and that makes a difference. What it also then reflects is, for example, specifically in Germany, that you mentioned, that the major group of Muslims in Germany are working class or Gastarbeiter in origin. They may be third generation non-Turkish speaking Germans, but they're still working class. And I think that that in itself makes the kind of context for cooperative discourse a little more difficult. I think the second difference is something that I essentially was pointing to by my own biographical information, and that is, except for a very small proportion of the American population, the Native Americans, everybody is an immigrant. Even the involuntary Africans are immigrants. And everybody's family has a history of, at some point, having to make the choice of in some way discovering integration. Now, at a conference on Islamophobia, I wanted to remind some of my Muslim friends that my family history is interesting because my German ancestry was at some point suspect, just like Muslims for the hyper suspicious Americans. My grandfather came from Prussia in order to avoid having his sons serve in the Prussian army, and he came out to central Wisconsin and was a farmer. But during the First World War, Germans were suspect, and Germans were arrested on suspicion of treason, and Germans faced significant difficulties because they had ethnic identification with the enemy. And so that you have that kind of development. But by the Second World War, thank goodness, or whatever, I mean, the price of not having Germans be harassed during the Second World War is the price that you're looking at. I can't speak German. You know, I can go back. I can go back to Germany and have schnitzel and sauerkraut and things like that, and really love it. But it's as a tourist. And so I think that those represent some of the differences. And then just finally, you identify a real and interesting challenge, especially in the United States, that the United States is not monolithic. The religious resurgence in the United States doesn't mean that everybody's suddenly turning into loving, tolerant believers. I think that one of the challenges that the United States is going to be facing, especially the kind of congregations that you were looking at, the white, old-fashioned Protestant, they are facing a dramatic reality. Demographic trends say that there will be no majority ethnic group in the United States in 40 years. That means whites of all European or whatever will no longer be a majority. That you will have a significant Hispanic population, you will have a significant variety of groups, and there will be no majority. There will be no American ethnic mainstream. And the congregation, the people that you're talking about are hunkering down already, especially in a place like Florida, where quote, those kind of whites are already thinking that they're a minority. And so that the challenge becomes, then we go back to how can we have a Tawhidi pluralistic sense of real identity. And that comes not just from the West in historic Islam dialogue or Muslim-Christian dialogue, but it comes from the global interactive dialogue that we're all going to have to be involved in. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to be with you.
With that response from Professor Voll, our today's seminar comes to a close. And before I before we end, I just want to say a few words here. I'm sure you all agree with me when I say that Professor Voll has presented a very stimulating and interesting talk. And both his talk and the question and answer session have raised issues which I'm sure will continue to linger in our mind and which we need to reflect. Of course, there are many other issues that also are not raised, and this is understandable. The topic that we have given to him is quite broad, but I'm sure we have all benefited from his presentation.